Good morning to everyone in person and hello to everyone online as well. Today, myself, Dr. George Aranda and Professor Julianne Lynch will be talking about the contextual dimensions of out-of-field teaching in computer science. Okay, so when we're talking about computer science out of field, we acknowledge that computer science in Australia is a relatively new specialist school subject, and this is consistent internationally as well. Now, quite often, computer science is taught as subordinate to other core units, such as core subjects, such as mathematics, and particularly in the Anglophone sphere, English. Now, in terms of the research that we're talking about today, we're referring to a government-funded project where we designed, delivered, and investigated a re-specialization credential for out-of-field secondary computer science teachers in Victoria, Australia. And now in today's presentation and in previous presentations, we've examined the views, experiences, and outcomes for these enrolled teachers. Now, what we're talking about today, we draw on enrolled teachers' written reflections to answer the question, how do out-of-field teachers perceive the influence of context on their experiences of enacting computer science curriculum in their settings? Now, in Australia and quite often in other places, te school teachers don't really have exposure to computer science in their own formal education. And because of that, computer science is quite often thought of in a narrow, stereotypical view. And quite often this can translate into computer science being associated with programming or coding exclusively, whereas it's a broader subject than just that. Now, there is a very high incidence of out-of-field teaching for computer science, with quite often with computer science not being featured in teacher education courses. Now, in Australia, it is as part of the digital technologies curriculum and is frequently taught by teachers without any specialist training. For example, in Australia, in Victoria, computer science, secondary computer science vacancies are the hardest to fill among secondary subject areas, with 44% of positions advertised in 2021 not really appointing anyone, which is, a really just amazing finding when I heard this. Now, because of this, the number of teachers that are involved with computer science education, there are not many people in the area. And if there are, they're working in isolation or they're working as part of very small teams in schools. And because of this, there is wide variation for how the curriculum is implemented in terms of, and different, there are wide differences between schools and how it is taught. Now, the teachers that took part in the course that we provided varied. As you can see there, the majority of those teachers had under 5 years experience. They came from a range of different qualifications, mathematics, science, English, etc. And they also came from a variety of locations as well, the majority being in metropolitan schools, say Melbourne. Some came from regional schools and rural as well, the most remote being 550 kilometres away from Melbourne. Now, there were 30 teachers in the course that was undertaken, and what we're talking about today is a subset of 11 of those teachers who consented to participate in the research aspect of what we're presenting today. I'll hand over to Julie.
Hey, thank you, George. Okay, so as George mentioned, this is part of a large design-based project where we developed a course. The course is almost finished. It's 4 units, delivered 1 unit at a time across last year and this year. And the participants in the research, of course, we're interested in the teachers today, but also the academics and other stakeholders participated in the broader study, have participated in surveys to varying levels of success in terms of response rate, in interviews at the end of each unit. And what we're focusing on today is the written reflections that the students have made across their experience in the course. So to date, let's say 3 1/3 semester-long units, where they've reflected on their learning and their teaching contexts. Now, we have a lot of written teacher reflection, and this has been primarily collected as a form of hurdle requirement attached to their assessment against the learning outcomes. So that's a qualification and something to remember when you're looking at this data. We have a lot because we have a lot of tasks that are hurdles and that are associated with the students, with the teachers' progress through the course. I did a quick tally up across the 4 units. The teachers will have completed over 40 reflection tasks. Because the units have progressed across different aspects of the content of computer science, which, as George mentioned, in Australia we call digital technologies, and also across different foci in terms of teaching capability. It covers a wide range of, I guess, topics or aspects that they've considered and reflected on, including student diversity, pedagogy, approaches to curriculum design and programming of the course, and assessment, among other things. So we're going to provide, I guess, what I'll say is a preliminary analysis, which draws on some of this data, some of this written reflection from the first 3 units. And then we'll complete that analysis once the final unit is completed and we've finished processing the last of the data. Now, I mentioned that these reflections are what have been submitted as part of the hurdle assessment task for the teachers in the course. And looking at them, not only are they diverse in terms of what the teachers have been prompted to consider or taken upon themselves to consider, they're also very rich, and the teachers have been extremely generous in their reflections and in their feedback. And they do know this is part of a design-based research project, and that their ongoing feedback has led to sort of ongoing development and improvements in the course content and delivery. We, looking across the reflections, think that a lot of them are actually quite candid, even though you might think there is like quite an obvious power relation between us as academic lecturers and the teachers as enrolled students in the course. The Australian context has a very low sort of power differential between teacher and students, and these practicing teachers have been very forthcoming in their sharing. I'll show you an example in a minute so that you understand what I'm saying. But they have included a lot of personal disclosure about difficulties and hardships they might have in their school setting as a professional and even personally. They've told us stories of their failures and their anxieties as well as their successes. And they've also, I guess, whether deliberate or not, have shared some of their biases and assumptions with us. So just to give you an example of the sort of candid responses that we've received, what you see on the screen at the moment is introductory task, the prompt that was given to the teachers in the 2nd unit. So it was the first thing they were asked to do in that unit was to email the teaching team. It was a new teaching team than what they'd got to know in the first unit. And the text that is below in the white is the beginning of one of the teachers' submissions for this particular hurdle task, where the teacher says, I'm a 4th year mathematics teacher that lives in regional Victoria. I was roped into teaching an internet website design course after the last teacher left, and the alternative teacher was in their 60s and was less than proficient with technology, shall we say. I didn't have much experience, mind you, but I did a coding course that I had then promptly forgotten back in university, and that put me at the top of the list. I don't seem to have done as badly as I thought. All the other teachers are all terrified of coding because they kept me in the class, and I seem to be locked in as a backup technology teacher now. So there are a number of things in there that lead me to think that this student is being quite candid, not least their open bias towards people who are in their 60s, which hits pretty close to home for me. Okay, so with this data, We wanted to look at the teachers' perspectives of how the context of their out of field teaching was impacting their enactment of the curriculum. And the so we used Braun et al.'s conceptual framework. This has been quite influential in looking at policy enactment coming out of the UK, and certainly I know quite a few Australian research projects have used this framework. I'm not sure to what extent it's been influential or as well known in Europe, so I've put the citation up there in case you're interested. So I'll just quickly run through these 4 dimensions of context that Braun et al. Theorise when they're looking at policy enactment, and which we then look at when we're reading through and when we're coding the teachers' written reflections about factors that were influencing their enactment of the formal curriculum. So the external context, I'm just going to look up on my other screen so that I get this right in terms of what Braun, Ball and Maguire and Hoskins wrote. The external dimension of school context includes such things as the degree and quality of local authority support, pressures and expectations from broader policy context, legal requirements, and responsibilities. And in the original text, they mentioned Ofsted. So those sort of external policy, formal curriculum, discourses that are, I guess, they originate beyond the school, but that interface with and might impact the school. The material dimension of the school context includes such things as school staffing, budgets, buildings, technology and infrastructure. And something that, of course, comes up a lot with out-of-field teaching and with any sort of re-specialisation or postgraduate or professional study. Time often comes up in the material dimension as being a resource and something that impacts policy enactment, in our case, curriculum policy. Professional dimensions include such things as the values of teachers and the school values and leadership, the teachers' commitments and experiences, the way that policy is managed in schools, and the sorts of professional relationships and roles that teachers have in schools and how they are enacted. And then the situated dimension really is looking at the local setting, such as the locale, so in terms of the human geography, where the school is set, the school's history and its intake, so the demographics and the needs and readiness and communities that the students in the school come from. I have some very brief examples here. One excerpt of written reflection for 3 of these dimensions. Yeah, I'll speak to that empty box after I've looked at these 3 that I've put up here. So in the central column there, and in terms of the external context, there are external policies such as curriculum policies, which in Australia we have the national curriculum, and then we have the state and territories various approaches to translating and interpreting and translating that curriculum into a formal requirement. These teachers are all in government schools, so they're all, I guess, have an expectation from their employer, the Victorian Department of Education, to deliver the Victorian version of the curriculum. Also, in the external context of those broader public discourses, I guess both the hype and the fears around technology, other sort of laws and policies that concern digital technologies and student learning and equity and those sorts of things. And then importantly, what I've noted there as epistemic power, so the subject wars and the various, I guess, the ways that different fields sit in relation to each other as being younger fields or older, more established fields, or on the way out fields, or very powerful and part of the sort of the secondary schooling core in terms of people's views and traditions found in the external context. For the material context, we have the obvious things when you think about digital technologies, is the integrity of infrastructure, is there Wi-Fi, does it work, those sorts of things. Access to specialist equipment and spaces, which I imagine is relevant to a lot of specialist fields. We heard it earlier today in terms of the art materials, and as I mentioned, the time allocated, particularly, and we hear a lot from teachers, particularly when in a retraining context, about time, but also in terms of teaching the sort of teacher conditions and the way that teachers' workplace conditions might vary from nation to nation about how much time teachers have for various types of teacher tasks. But importantly in here, there's also the time allocated to computer science learning. So how much time it gets in the timetable, how much student-facing time is available. The professional context, we have teachers' knowledge, confidence, role and agency, which of course we're familiar with those sorts of themes in out-of-field teaching literature. The opportunities and experiences of collaborating with colleagues or not, whatever the case might be. And George mentioned that often if this subject is taught in a school, it might be taught by one teacher or by a very small group that are attached to another subject team. And the various views that are held by leadership and by colleagues, other teachers, about what computer science is and its relative value. And then the situated context, particular importance are views about students, their readiness and their levels of interest in computer science as an area of learning. So it was very interesting to go through, and as with any coding, and I've used this particular framework with other projects, of course there is double coding because the commentary, the data is rich and the framework is a construct. But what I find particularly interesting is what is sort of foregrounded, what is the sort of go-to explanation, and what aspects of context are not really engaged in that are either taken for granted or that are sort of unquestioned. So in terms of the material context, I've got that quote there, there's very little time allocated to this subject in the timetable, making it harder to cover all content in depth. There's no explanation given, and this is a common complaint in this particular field. There's no explanation given. It's assumed that all content needs to be covered. So there's sort of this tension between the time that's allocated and the external context, where there is, at least for the last 10 years, there has been a well elaborated curriculum framework and particular requirements that teachers are supposed to teach to and that students are supposed to learn. For the professional context, again, I'm interested in what so I guess the primary description of the factor is here. So this teacher describes a lack of cohesion across their school, making it challenging for staff to trust the processes the leadership team are trying to implement. Our school leadership team is working towards improving school outcomes. So that's an external requirement, an external visual requirement. However, some of the improvement strategies have been overwhelming for the staff who are working on adapting curriculum to version 2, to a new version of curriculum. So again, there's a lot of focus on that professional context, and many times, I guess, a criticism of leadership without really engaging with the relationship between the external context and the position of leadership and the sorts of things that leaders are grappling with in schools. And then finally, the situated learning, the quote down there, my school is in a rural location and does not have a strong digital program. And this teacher goes on to say their main focus is on improving digital literacy, which may or may not be considered by some people to be part of this curriculum area. And what's interesting there, I think, is the and. It's sort of taken for granted that these two things go together, that rural situatedness would go side to side, side by side with sort of a lack of interest and a lack of skills and maybe a lack of relevance of computer science as a subject area. And that certainly comes through in some of the data too. These are some early insights, and I think this is our final substantive slide. So unsurprisingly, professional context is a primary reference point for these teachers when they reflect on the context of their out-of-field computer science teaching. And that'd be the case for in-field, out-of-field, lots of fields. The professional context is really that day-to-day working with colleagues, working with leadership, and working with the resources in your school setting. So that's primary. There was influence on professional context. The professional context influenced the material context. And this was quite prominent where particularly leaders' views and the way they valued or didn't value computer science content was perceived as being directly related to how much time they got on the timetable, what sort of resources they might be able to buy and use, and the sort of subject offerings, whether it was going to be an elective subject or whether it was going to be a compulsory subject, those sorts of things. But the influence of the external context, as I mentioned earlier, was largely unacknowledged by the teachers, which sort of shows where their perspective is in terms of understanding the position of leaders and their level of agency as members of a profession. What was interesting is that there's a constellation of what were repeated as sort of impactful material factors where you've got subject offerings, whether you get a subject offered each of the year levels, the amount of time you get for that subject in this sort of poor cousin field, and the number of students that might elect to go into a subject when these are often presented as elective subjects to students. And this can be sort of lead to a growth cycle, or it can lead to a sort of a down cycle where the subject becomes more and more elective, and the interest of students goes down because there's nothing for them sort of to grab hold of. And this interacted in interesting ways with the teachers' perceptions of the situated context. And where some communities and some cohorts were viewed as being, I guess, as this subject was viewed as being less relevant to them. And for other cohorts, and those that were most advantaged, it was viewed as being an important, relevant subject. So some deficit thinking there.